Okay, part two, after the exposition. We've already gotten into the story, and you may notice the central conflict, which is me trying to entertain myself. Now, I'll tell you this, there's a little more to the central conflict than that, and that part will come in now. And scene. So, in my neighborhood, I mentioned to you the two poorest houses that are in the street, and they had some older boys, and they seemed to attract other boys from around the neighborhood. Now, part of the entertainment in my neighborhood was sometimes on the evenings we might walk and the neighbors would gather at either end of the street as local law enforcement came to arrest some of the adults in the house, and occasionally social services would show up and tote some of the kids off. These guys were legitimately criminals. My road dead-ended at the foot of the mountain and turned into a dirt road, and occasionally a flatbed truck would come up and pull out a bunch of stolen cars that they had driven up onto this mountain road and stripped. And so because of that, as a small child, you learn to almost develop a sixth sense to keep an eye when maybe a little gang of these young poor kids who had not much to do and not much, so they might steal things, and for entertainment they might find it funny to pick up the rocks on our gravel road and throw them at a 5-year-old child like me. So I kind of had developed a sixth sense to be able to hide when I was playing out in the yard. I would have been in the backyard playing, but we had a bunch of German Shepherds in the backyard. My father bred German Shepherds. It was fenced in. And we had a whole new brood of puppies which would chew all over me. So I chose to play in the front yard that day. And now I had grown bored because I ran out of nails. So what could I do? So had my father's nice claw hammer, had a red handle with a black grip on it that you held on to, and I began to toss it up in the air and flip it and catch it by the handle. And it gave me a little trick to do, kind of like you guys do on TikTok nowadays. And so I flipped it, and I got to where I'd catch it once, tried to flip it twice, occasionally catching the claw hammer part of it, occasionally pulling it off. And I really began to just get focused on this activity, so focused that I was not paying attention to my surroundings. I was standing facing the road, tossing the hammer up in the air, tossing it up again, when suddenly, out of my peripheral vision, I caught some movement and looked up. And it was a combination of the boys from both ends of the street and a few others that I didn't recognize. And most forebodingly, their leader was Billy Brown, who lived on the house right by the mountain and was basically, he was a teenager at the time, was known for being a neighborhood bully and a criminal, and I'm really not kidding about the criminal part. He actually ended up going to prison and dying a violent death in prison, and he went to prison for violent crimes. But at that age, he still, he was the kind of guy that would beat a little kid up, but I didn't worry about him killing me, but I didn't want to get beat up by him. But as I said, their favorite hobby was to throw rocks at a little kid. And if they saw you and you took off running, that just gave them a moving target. So there I stood with this hammer, staring at them, quivering, trying not to wet my pants, feeling moments of terror like I had never felt before. My 5-year-old brain racing. Could I sprint to the porch and get inside before they maybe rushed into the yard and beat the heck out of me? Or even if I tried that, would they throw rocks at me? Would one of them bust the window, which might inspire my mom to do who knows what? But I knew one thing, I would somehow get a spanking for causing the commotion. So there I stood, and it dawned on me, I had become the subject of their attention. In my mind, I thought, oh, they're fascinated with me throwing this hammer up in the air. So I had a brilliant epiphany. I will impress these teenage boys. So I reached down and threw the hammer the highest I had thrown it all day, and just gave them my best little John Wayne cool kid stare. In my terror, I had a short lapse of short-term memory wherein I had forgotten I had thrown the hammer up. It didn't last long, and I remembered the hammer and looked up just as it was spinning toward my head, and the claw part caught me right here. This was 51 years ago, and I still have a little dent right there and a scar that, well, I've carried the rest of my life so far. But anyway, when that hammer hit me, it was the first time I'd actually seen stars. Like, my vision went black and I saw little spots. Instant pain, not knowing what to do, and I suddenly felt warm blood running down and burning my eye. I did what any kid did, screamed, grabbed my corner of my head and covered my eye, turned and sprinted toward the gate for where the dogs were, screaming like any child who's just nearly been knocked unconscious. I slung open the gate, made sure and turned around and locked it. If the dogs got out, that would guarantee me a spanking. Ran to the back door, which was locked, and started beating on the screen door. My mother comes to the door, yells at me because I'm trying to get into the house and I'm going to get blood all over the kitchen floor, and orders me to stand still. So I stood there quivering, crying, trying my best not to cry in front of my strong Southern mother, while she went and got some towels and water and came out and got a towel and enough water and enough pressure to stop the bleeding. Then she proceeded to take me into the restroom. And scene. That pretty much brings us from the exposition and the introduction of the character, this young 5-year-old boy, and a vivid description of the setting with increasing tension moving up toward the climax, the moment that the claw hammer struck my head, and the extended climax, me running around and my mother starting to take care of me. And now we move into the resolution, or the denouement, what happens after the climax. That always has to be short. There's no more conflict. There's some kind of resolution to it, and conflict is all that drives the story. You might have noticed a little irony. In my moment of trying to impress those boys to keep myself from being physically harmed, I actually physically harmed myself, which is what makes it a good story, that powerful irony. You might even notice that harken back a little to the exposition and the pros and cons, the violence and the peaceful resolution of that year, 1968. So anyway, back to the story. And scene. So my mother takes me into the bathroom and proceeds to scrub. For some reason, she had to scrub the wound with soap and water that burned like all get out. And then she poured peroxide on it, and then she poured rubbing alcohol on it. And then worst of all, she broke out the 2 medicines that had to treat any open wound in 1968. Mercurochrome coming in 2 flavors. The blue bottle with the swan on it that didn't burn, and the red bottle with the swan on it that burned like fire. The red bottle was the one my grandfather said did a better job and was required for any serious wounds. So my mother, of course, gives me the red bottle and splashes mercurochrome on it, staining my skin, but apparently killing any germs and perhaps nerve endings in my head. So I somehow survived my father coming home for dinner. That was my biggest worry after that, was would I get a spanking from my dad for hitting myself in the head with his hammer. But he came home from the factory tired, sat down in his recliner, read his paper while my mother cooked dinner, saw my head, asked me what happened. I said, I was swinging your hammer and hit myself in the head. He shook his head and said, you need to learn how to use a hammer, son. A little bit later, it was time for our annual Easter picture, and that was a mandatory thing in my house. You had to all get dressed up. You had your Easter baskets. One of the few times we got candy. My mother would make us stand in front of the house, in front of a beautiful snowball bush, she called, stare at the sun while she took a small camera, ancient camera my father had bought when he was in Korea in the military, And she would stare down at it for about 5 minutes while we squinted, staring at the sun, and take the annual Easter picture. Now that brought back up something about the wound. My mother did not want me in the picture with this big gash in my head. So she brilliantly stuffed some cotton in it so it would kind of match my tow-headed hair at the time, and took the picture. That picture still exists. My mother still brings it out and shows it every now and then and tells the story about when little Ronnie hit himself in the head with a hammer. Lastly, I seem to notice that the neighborhood boys, in my little mind, showed me a touch more respect. And I concocted an ending to the story wherein I bet these guys think, that's that crazy little kid that hit himself in the head with a hammer. I don't know if we should mess with him, because there's no telling what that crazy kid will do. Scene. And that's the end of the story. So if you notice, after the conflict, I gave a couple of resolutions, the Easter picture and the little bit of like kind of going back to the exposition, some broader abstract ideas about life in general, to try to give that a sense of, coming full circle back to the beginning, where we're talking about more important things. Even though it was very personalized, it was kind of extended to that. All right, I hope you've enjoyed that. As you write your narrative, try to write one that's really real. A couple of things that I did beyond my brainstorming, I made sure I had lots of sensorial writing in there. What do I mean by that? It appeals to the 5 senses: touch, taste, smell, hearing, or sight, and sound. And so you get those in your story by lots of adjectives and adverbs.